want is love, and she has been giving it to me. I will miss her soft kiss. I will miss everything about her.
I knew it was going to be hard. I didn't know it was going to be this hard. Last time we were here, I got engaged to you.
Her fellow women have been giving her the oral sex she wants, and she wants me to be doing the same. I am not a woman. I have my...
Lisa was gone. And the part that hit hardest was not a screaming breakup, not some explosive final scene where one person storms out and the other throws out one last speech for the cameras, but the colder and stranger fact that Daniel was left reacting to an ending he did not get to control, which is a brutal place for anyone to land when they have spent so much time acting like one more talk, one more explanation, one more emotional push might still put the story back in their hands. Because once the other person stops feeding the cycle, the whole balance changes. And suddenly, the one who used to ask the questions is the one pacing in the silence, trying to figure out when the floor disappeared. That is what makes this harder to dismiss as a normal breakup story. Because a normal breakup gives people something easy to point at. One fight, one betrayal, one humiliating moment, one sentence that cuts too deep and ends everything on the spot. But this did not feel like one sharp collapse. It felt like the aftermath of a pattern that had been building quietly while Daniel still thought he had time, still thought he had one more round left in him, still thought Lisa would stay in orbit long enough for him to get the final answer, the final reaction, the final moment where he could feel like he was back on top of the situation, and then one day that opening was simply gone. And that is the first question hanging over everything. Did Daniel lose Lisa in one dramatic moment, or did he slowly train her to leave? Because those are not the same thing. And the second version is a lot darker. Anyone can point to a breakup and say emotions were high, people were hurt, things got messy. End of story. That is the easy read. The harder read is asking what kind of relationship had formed by the end. What kind of emotional weather had become normal? What kind of exchange kept repeating until silence started to look less like weakness and more like the only move left for someone who had realized every road in front of her led back to the same place. Because by the time Lisa went quiet, the fight was no longer about romance in the sweet, delusional way people like to frame these shows when they want to pretend love is the center of every disaster. This had shifted into something else. Daniel did not look like a man searching for peace. He looked like a man who still believed the ending was negotiable as long as he could keep the conversation alive. As long as he could keep Lisa explaining, defending, responding, correcting, crying, clarifying, doing anything except stepping outside the game completely. He did not need a huge scene to keep control. In some ways, a huge scene would have been easier to read. What made this mess sharper was how ordinary the pressure could look while it was happening. One more question, one more challenge, one more push for the full truth, one more chance for Lisa to prove she was being honest. And after enough rounds like that, you stop asking whether the point is truth at all, because truth usually settles conflict while control keeps needing fresh material. That is why Lisa's silence matters so much. Silence can mean fear. Silence can mean exhaustion. Silence can mean guilt. Silence can also mean clarity. And that is where this story gets uncomfortable. Because if Lisa stopped talking because she finally understood there was no right answer available to her, then the breakup stops looking like one final failure and starts looking like the end result of a long, emotional lesson. One where she learned that every response would be turned into another opening, another weakness, another reason the cycle had to continue. If she cried, the tears could be used against her. If she explained, the explanation could be picked apart. If she pulled back, that distance could be framed as proof. That is not a fair fight. That is a trap with better lighting. And the people watching from the outside often get fooled by the wrong thing. They see the calmer person and assume calm means reason. They see the quieter person and assume quiet means she has nothing left to say, when sometimes quiet means she has said enough to know the system is built against her. That is the cruel twist in stories like this. The loud collapse is easy to identify. The slow internal decision is harder to notice until it is already over. Daniel seemed to think there would still be time for one more exchange, one more moment to recover the frame, one more push that would leave him holding the final version of events. Lisa's silence took that away, and that is why the ending felt harsher than a blow-up ever could, because a loud ending still gives both people a scene. This one denied Daniel the scene he seemed to be counting on. So when you look at the aftermath, the temptation is to ask when Lisa left, but the sharper question is when she stopped participating in the terms Daniel needed, because that is where the story begins to turn. Quiet exits do not come out of nowhere. They are usually built in private, under pressure, through repetition, through disappointment, through the slow realization that the next conversation will sound different on the surface and feel exactly the same underneath. By the time somebody leaves without one last performance, the leaving itself is rarely sudden. The real exit has usually been under construction for a long time, brick by brick. Daniel kept saying he wanted honesty. And on paper, that sounds fair, because when somebody finds out they were not told the full truth, nobody is going to clap politely and call it character development, but the pattern started looking different the longer you watched what happened after each reveal. Because hurt people usually ask for the truth so they can decide what to do with it, while controlling people keep widening the test after they get the answer, and that difference matters if you are trying to understand whether this relationship was breaking under pain or being managed through pressure. You can see the setup in the way Patience kept getting sold to Lisa like it was some noble proof of love, when in practice it kept functioning like a waiting room for Daniel's convenience. Every delay came with another reason, every dodge came with another emotional wrapper, and every time Lisa started sensing something was off, she was asked to hold on a little longer, give more grace, trust a little more, send a little more support, and ignore the growing mismatch between what she was promised and what she was getting. That is not repair. Repair reduces confusion. This pattern kept feeding it. Then look at what happened when the pressure finally hit something concrete. When Lisa got the message asking who Daniel had married in Benin City, his first response was not denial, shock, or outrage at some lie meant to sabotage them. He asked who sent it. That is such a small detail, but small details are where these stories stop being romance and start becoming receipt. Because a person blindsided by nonsense usually attacks the nonsense, while a person cornered by truth often attacks the leak. And when Lisa pushed for a direct answer, Daniel did what he often seemed to do once the facts got too sharp. He slowed things down, made them sound complicated, and let the conversation drift away from the blunt question and toward a foggier emotional explanation. That is the part people miss when they watch this kind of mess like it is only about one huge betrayal. The betrayal matters, obviously, but the structure around it matters too. Daniel said he wanted truth, yet when the truth arrived, the pattern did not move toward clarity. It moved toward management. Uncle Bio appeared, the situation was reframed as cultural, Lisa was warned not to react emotionally, and the whole thing started sounding less like a man trying to clean up a disaster and more like a system trying to control the temperature in the room. That calm tone can fool people. Calm is not always wisdom. Sometimes calm is what a person sounds like when they still think they have the upper hand. And that question gets bigger when you back up and look at Lisa's role in the cycle. Why did she keep explaining? Why keep trying to soften everything, patch everything, and survive one more round of emotional scrutiny? Part of the answer is ugly and human. Because if you are invested enough, explanation starts to feel like action. You think one cleaner version, one fuller confession, one more emotional appeal will finally end the tension. But in a pattern like this, explanations do not end the conflict if the conflict is still useful to the other person. You can hear that in the aftermath too. Even after Daniel learned enough to make a clean choice, he did not vanish from the situation. He stayed close enough to keep the emotional case open, shared the ride back, stayed in the hotel orbit, and kept the uncertainty alive. That does not prove he felt nothing. It suggests something more interesting and more dangerous. The ambiguity still served him. And there were earlier signs that the relationship had already become more about control than comfort. Lisa herself described rules, needing permission, being corrected, being told what she could do, how she should act, even how she should present herself. And once you pair those complaints with the lunch scene energy, the dismissive little correction, the sense that Daniel kept shifting from charm to superiority the moment he felt steady, The whole thing starts reading less like concern and more like someone who enjoyed being the standard Lisa had to chase. That matters because people often confuse constant correction with leadership and calm dominance with maturity, when sometimes it is simply someone getting comfortable enough to stop hiding the controlling side. So the cleaner question is not whether Daniel had a right to be hurt. He did. The sharper question is what he did with that hurt. Did he use truth to make a decision, or did he use truth to keep moving the goalpost while Lisa kept trying to reach it? Because by the time somebody is still explaining, and the conflict still will not close, you are no longer watching a search for honesty. You are watching a pattern where one person keeps talking because she thinks the next answer might save the relationship, and the other keeps listening because the instability still gives him leverage. And once a relationship reaches that stage, the silence that comes later does not come out of nowhere. It usually arrives after somebody has learned the hard way that explanation was never the same thing as safety. Lisa does not work as a hero in this story, and forcing her into one would flatten the whole thing into the usual lazy split, where one person becomes the villain, the other becomes the victim, and the audience gets to feel smart without having to think, when the truth is messier and a lot more human. Because people in fragile relationships do not always respond well. They do not always tell the full story cleanly. They stall, they hide, they soften facts, they answer one part and avoid another. And all of that can be true at the same time that they are stuck in a pattern where every mistake becomes permanent leverage, every weak moment becomes fresh evidence, and every attempt to fix the mess somehow feeds it again. That is the trap Lisa seems to slide into. She does not need to be innocent for the pattern to turn ugly. She only needs to be imperfect, emotionally cornered, and still invested enough to keep trying. That is what makes people easy to hold inside a cycle like this. A person who knows they have handled things badly already walks into the next conversation off balance. They arrive apologizing before the real exchange even starts. They try to explain, but the explanation comes out tangled because guilt scrambles clarity. Then the other person hears the hesitation, spots the inconsistency, and suddenly the whole conversation shifts again, not toward repair, toward control, toward the endless audit that somehow never closes. And that is where guilt gets confused with accountability, which is one of the oldest and ugliest tricks in relationship drama. Accountability has an endpoint. You admit what you did, you answer the question, you face the consequence, and then the other person decides whether they can move forward or not. Control has no endpoint. Control keeps the conversation alive because the conversation itself is the weapon. It does not want closure. It wants access. It wants one more emotional opening, one more explanation, one more chance to make the other person feel shaky enough to stay in the weaker position. That is why Lisa starts looking less like someone being fairly confronted and more like someone being kept in a state of emotional probation. You can see how impossible the logic becomes once that dynamic hardens. If she talks, she loses, because every word gives Daniel something else to challenge, reinterpret, or hold against her later. If she cries, she loses, because tears are easy to frame as manipulation when somebody has already decided your emotional reaction is part of the problem. If she pulls back, she loses, because distance can be turned into proof that she is hiding something, feeling guilty, or refusing to take responsibility. There is no clean move left on the board, and once a relationship reaches that stage, the question stops being how she can explain herself better and starts becoming whether explaining herself was ever going to change the outcome at all. That does not erase Lisa's role in creating chaos. She seems like the kind of person who could delay, dodge, or hope a messy situation would somehow improve if she managed the timing well enough, which is a common fantasy and a terrible plan. People think postponing the truth gives them control, but most of the time it only hands the other person a sharper knife later. So no, this is not a defense of every choice she made. It is a defense of basic proportion. Making mistakes does not mean you deserve an endless process where every answer opens another courtroom session. Being guilty of something does not mean the other person gets permanent ownership of your emotional state. That is the line this story keeps brushing against. And once you see that, Lisa's later quiet starts to read differently. At first, her explaining probably looked like hope. Maybe she thought one fuller answer would calm him down. Maybe she thought one honest, emotional moment would finally cut through the tension. Maybe she thought if she stayed soft enough, patient enough, remorseful enough, the conflict would shrink. But the conflict did not shrink. It kept renewing itself. That is what breaks people. Not one huge explosion, but the dawning realization that no version of honesty feels sufficient once the relationship has turned into a test you are no longer allowed to pass. So the shift in Lisa is not dramatic at first. That is why it matters. She does not suddenly become fearless. She does not flip into some perfect self-respecting icon with a speech ready and a cinematic soundtrack playing in the background like life owes her a trailer. She gets quieter, less eager to persuade, less desperate to win the emotional case, less committed to proving that she is being understood. And that is the first real warning sign that the ending is no longer theoretical. Because when someone stops trying to win the argument, it often means they have started imagining life outside it. Then the mood changes, and this is where the story stops feeling like ordinary reality TV chaos and starts feeling colder. Because the loud part is fading, Daniel seems less pressed, Lisa seems less reactive, and on the surface that looks like improvement, the kind of fake calm viewers often mistake for progress because people are so desperate to believe silence means peace, when sometimes silence means the opposite. Sometimes silence means somebody has stopped trying to save the room and started figuring out how to leave it without one more piece of themselves getting dragged into the argument. That is what makes this stretch so unsettling. Lisa is not suddenly glowing with closure. She is not speaking with fresh confidence. She is not trying to reclaim the narrative in some dramatic, camera-friendly way. She is simply less available to the old pattern. Less defending, less chasing, less visible panic, less of that frantic energy people show when they still believe the next explanation might finally land. And if you have ever watched a relationship die in slow motion, you know how eerie that stage can be. Because the person who has been pushing, pleading, clarifying, apologizing, and emotionally overfunctioning does not always blow up before they go quiet. Sometimes they flatten out first. The urgency drains. The case is no longer being argued with full force because somewhere privately the verdict has already started to settle. Daniel, though, is exactly the kind of person who might read that silence the wrong way, especially if he has grown used to emotional reaction as proof of influence. A calmer Lisa can look like a more manageable Lisa if you are still seeing the relationship as a system you understand. Less pushback feels like less danger. Less visible pain feels like less resistance. And that is why people who think they are winning often miss the exit signs first. They assume the storm is settling because the volume dropped. They do not ask why the energy changed. They do not ask whether the other person is still emotionally invested in the same way. They do not ask whether they are being offered peace or being slowly removed from relevance. That is the trap for Daniel in this phase. If he believed the relationship was finally stabilizing, then he was watching the wrong indicators. The calmer tone, the reduced friction, the lower emotional temperature, none of that proves repair. In a relationship built on reaction, silence is not neutral. Silence is a threat. It is the most dangerous move because it refuses the whole structure. No fresh tears to interrogate, no new defense to challenge, no anxious over-explaining to keep the cycle alive. Once Lisa stops feeding the machine does not look healed. It looks starved. The problem is that the person who built their confidence around always getting one more reaction rarely sees starvation for what it is until it is too late. And this is where the small behavior changes matter more than any giant scene. Lisa does not need a dramatic speech for the shift to become visible. The clues are quieter than that. She is less eager to clear every misunderstanding immediately, less invested in fixing the emotional weather in real time, less likely to chase reassurance from the very person who keeps making reassurance feel conditional. She is still there, but differently, present without fully offering herself up to the old pattern. That difference is tiny if you are only watching for fireworks. It is huge if you understand how people mentally leave before they physically go. The audience starts to feel it before Daniel does, and that gap creates the suspense. What had Lisa already decided by this point? Was the silence a pause, a test, a private countdown? Did she already know the relationship was over and simply had not made the external move yet? Did Daniel notice the change at all? Or did he mistake emotional withdrawal for compliance because that interpretation felt safer to him? Those questions matter because they turn the coming break from a random event into a slow reveal. The ending does not need to arrive with noise if the real turn already happened off camera in Lisa's posture, her tone, her reduced need to be understood at all costs. There is something brutal about that stage, because one person is still living in the argument while the other has begun stepping outside it. Daniel may still think there is time for one more conversation, one more correction, one more chance to regain the upper hand if needed. Lisa, by contrast, is no longer acting like somebody trying to win. She is acting like somebody conserving energy. And once you notice that difference, the whole story changes shape. The silence is no longer a sign that things are getting better. It is the clearest sign yet that one person has stopped performing their side of the dynamic, and the person who thinks he is finally getting the calmer version of her may be standing right in front of the exit without realizing the door is already open. By this point, the most honest way to read the split is not as one huge dramatic escape, but as a visible change in distance, tone, and emotional availability. Because public material rarely gives you some neat movie-style departure where one person stands under an airport board with tears in their eyes and a perfectly timed final text, and that is fine. Because the quieter evidence is often stronger anyway. The kind you spot in how a person starts pulling their energy back, how the urgency drains out of their replies, how the connection stops feeling active and starts feeling managed. How? The whole thing gives off that strange separated but not fully announced tension where the relationship looks present on the surface but hollow underneath. That is what matters here, not fantasy scenes. Observable shift, less engagement, less emotional chasing, less sense that Lisa was still trying to rescue every difficult moment before it turned into another exhausting exchange. You start to feel the gap in presence before you ever need some huge declaration to confirm it. Her side looks less invested in proving, less interested in calming, less willing to keep stepping into the same loop. And once that happens, the practical part of leaving is already underway in the only form that counts first. Not luggage, not flights, not some secret code word to a friend overseas. Emotional withdrawal. Change in posture. Change in tone. Change in how much of yourself you keep offering to a person who keeps turning that access into pressure. That matters because people love the myth of the giant showdown. They want one final blowout, one shocking confession, one moment where the whole thing explodes cleanly and gives the audience an easy villain, an easy victim, and an easy timeline. Life is usually meaner and less theatrical than that. Most controlling dynamics do not break in one giant event. They break when one person stops feeding the cycle. That is the part viewers often miss because it is less flashy and more devastating. The real break begins when attention gets rationed, when urgency fades, when the old bait stops working, when silence starts replacing over explanation, and when one person is still trying to keep the emotional machine running while the other has quietly stepped away from the fuel source. And yes, a fair-minded read has to leave room for the obvious counterpoint. Some viewers will say Daniel was not controlling the ending, he was trying to get answers, and on the surface, that is not a ridiculous defense. If you feel lied to, if the relationship has become unstable, if you think pieces are missing, you are going to ask questions. Nobody gets a medal for pretending confusion feels good. But the defense starts to wobble when you test it against the pattern rather than the wording. If answers were the goal, why did the tension stay alive after each exchange? Why did each round seem to create another round instead of closing one? Why did clarity never seem to produce calm? Why did Lisa keep sounding like someone trying to survive the conversation instead of complete it? Those are not small cracks. Those are the whole structure giving itself away. Because a person who wants truth reaches a point where truth forces a decision. Stay, go, forgive, end it, reset the terms, do something concrete. A person who wants control keeps the case open. The details keep getting revisited, the emotional temperature keeps getting managed instead of resolved, and the other person remains stuck in a low-grade trial where no answer feels final enough. That is why Lisa's withdrawal feels so telling in this stretch. She no longer looks like someone waiting for the right explanation to land. She looks like someone who has started understanding that the explanation was never the finish line. The process itself had become the punishment. And once you see it that way, even the public separation energy starts reading differently. The space between them is no longer only about hurt feelings or trust issues. It starts looking like a struggle over authorship. Who gets to frame the story? Who gets to decide what the ending means? Daniel may still have believed that one more conversation would let him shape the final version, make his case, prove his stance, hold the upper hand one last time. Lisa, by stepping back without endlessly feeding the conflict, was beginning to take something far more threatening away from him than affection. She was taking away access to the script. That is why this stage feels so tense even without a massive visible showdown. The practical part of leaving has already begun once one person stops offering live material for the dynamic to feed on. And by then, the relationship is no longer breaking over facts alone. The real break is shifting somewhere sharper and harder to admit. It is no longer only about what was true. It is about who gets to write the ending once truth stops being enough to keep the old pattern alive. This is the stretch where the whole story stops sounding like two people stuck in a painful mess and starts sounding like one person trying to keep control of how the mess gets remembered. Because there comes a point in some breakups when the fight is no longer about saving anything, it is about framing everything. And once you notice that shift in Daniel, a lot of his calmer energy stops reading like patience and starts reading like confidence. The kind of confidence people have when they still believe they own the room, own the pace, and own the final version of events, even if the relationship itself is already collapsing under their feet. Up to now, you could still give Daniel the benefit of the doubt if you wanted to. You could tell yourself he was hurt, confused, searching for clarity, trying to process too much at once, and that is exactly why this section matters. Because this is where that softer reading starts running out of road. Closure has a shape. Closure is painful, but it moves somewhere. It asks what happened, what it means, and what happens next. Control over the story has a different shape. It keeps circling. It needs one more point made, one more reaction drawn out, one more emotional concession, one more chance to stand in the stronger position while the other person keeps explaining from the weaker one. And by the time the audience starts feeling that Daniel is no longer chasing peace, the whole emotional center of the story changes. This is no longer a damaged man trying to understand what happened to his relationship. This is a man who still seems to think the ending belongs to him. That is why the earlier setup starts paying off here. All that talk about honesty, all those repeated efforts to reopen, revisit, and reshape the conflict, all those moments where tension survived even after fresh information entered the room, they no longer feel like random signs of a relationship under stress. They feel like the pattern itself. If Daniel wanted closure, then each hard conversation should have brought him closer to a decision. Instead, the pressure stayed alive. The emotional case stayed open. Lisa kept looking like someone being pulled back into the same courtroom with slightly different wording each time. And once Lisa began to pull back, once she stopped performing the old panic, once she stopped racing to fill every silence with another defense, Daniel's calm stopped feeling reassuring and started feeling dangerous. Because calm in the wrong hands is not always peace. Sometimes it is the expression of a person who still thinks they have the upper hand. And Lisa's side changes too in a way that matters more here than anywhere else. Earlier, her distance could still be misread as weakness, confusion, or emotional shutdown. Now it starts to look like planning. Not necessarily some dramatic secret operation, not some invented thriller scene people add when they run out of real analysis, but planning in the emotional sense, the kind that matters first and hardest. She is no longer spending herself trying to win back understanding from someone who seems determined to keep the process alive. She is not chasing the old repair fantasy with the same energy. She is conserving. She is choosing what not to give. And once somebody in a reactive dynamic starts doing that, the power balance shifts faster than the louder person usually realizes. That is also why this section hits harder emotionally than the earlier analysis. Before, the story was asking whether the relationship was damaged. Now it is asking who had been living in a false version of where the power still sat. Daniel's tone suggests he still thought he could manage the end, that he could absorb each new development without losing his grip on the story, that if Lisa stayed in orbit long enough, he would still get the last meaningful exchange. But the audience can now see something he either missed or refused to see. Lisa was no longer trying to survive the argument. She was already moving beyond it. That is a devastating realization for anyone who has mistaken emotional access for permanent leverage. And once the story lands there, the real contrast becomes impossible to ignore. A person wanting closure asks hard questions because they are trying to decide whether there is anything left. A person wanting control over the story asks hard questions because the questioning itself preserves their position. One leads to movement, the other leads to repetition. One accepts an ending once the facts are painful enough, the other tries to manage the ending so it still feels like a win. That is why the quiet withdrawal from Lisa becomes so explosive in hindsight. She did not need a dramatic speech to change the balance. She only needed to stop giving Daniel what the pattern had taught him to expect. Fresh reaction, fresh defense, fresh material. And now the biggest question in the whole story starts to take shape, sharper than anything before it. Because once you strip away the noise, once you strip away the language of honesty and patience and emotional processing, you are left staring at one brutal possibility. When Lisa finally stepped out of his orbit, was Daniel shocked because she left, or was he shocked because he did not get to direct the exit? Once a breakup spills into public view, the relationship ends twice. First between the two people in it, then again in front of everyone else who suddenly decides they are a juror, a therapist, a detective, and a body language expert all at once, which is always a terrible combination. Because the minute viewers start picking sides, the story stops being only about what happened and starts becoming a fight over which version of what happened feels cleaner, sharper, easier to defend, and more flattering to the person telling it. That is where this gets bigger than Daniel and Lisa as a couple, because now you are watching narrative control in real time. One camp looks at Lisa pulling away and says she ran because she was guilty. Because guilty people go quiet, guilty people avoid the final conversation, guilty people leave before the full truth catches up to them. It is a simple argument, neat, satisfying, and like most neat arguments on reality TV, suspiciously eager to do the thinking for you. The other camp sees the same silence and reads it completely differently. They say Lisa did not leave because she had no answer. She left because she had already answered enough to realize the process would never end. Same silence, two opposite verdicts, and that is why this part matters. Not to preach. To test which read better fits the pattern we have already watched unfold. Start with the first claim. Did Lisa pull back because she was cornered by truth? That is possible in the abstract. People do disappear when they do not want to face what they did. People absolutely retreat when staying would force them to account for too much. Nobody needs to pretend otherwise. But if that is the full explanation here, then Daniel's role should look simpler than it does. If he was only pressing for truth, then each exchange should have narrowed the conflict instead of stretching it out. Each answer should have moved the story toward a decision instead of toward another emotional round. Yet what the visible pattern kept showing was not conflict shrinking under clarity. It was conflict staying alive after clarity had already entered the room. That is the problem with the guilty ran away reading. It explains Lisa's silence, but it does not explain why Daniel seemed to keep needing the case open. Now test the other claim. Did Lisa leave because she was done being cornered? That read does not require her to be flawless. It does not even require her to be mostly right. It only requires one thing, that the relationship had reached a point where every response from her created fresh access for him. And that is exactly what the pattern started to suggest. Talk. And the answer gets challenged. Cry, and the emotion gets framed as manipulation. Pull back, and the distance gets used as proof. Once viewers saw enough of that logic, her silence stopped reading like a dodge and started reading like refusal. Not refusal to face reality, but refusal to keep participating in a setup where the terms never stopped moving. And this is where audiences split for a reason that has less to do with evidence and more to do with psychology. People are weirdly attached to visible effort. If one person keeps talking, keeps questioning, keeps showing up with a composed face and a steady tone, many viewers instinctively reward that person as the adult in the room. Calm sells. Calm looks organized. Calm looks prepared. The only problem is that calm can also be the favorite costume of someone who still thinks they own the frame. A soft voice does not automatically mean soft intentions. Sometimes it means the person believes they have enough leverage not to raise it. That is why Daniel's public image in this kind of breakup is so important. If he stays measured while Lisa withdraws, then the surface optics lean his way. He looks grounded. She looks evasive. He looks patient. She looks unstable or checked out. It is the kind of contrast reality TV feeds on because it lets half the audience shout accountability while the other half shouts emotional abuse, and both sides feel morally superior before breakfast. But once you go back to the pattern instead of the vibe, the balance shifts. Daniel does not only look like a hurt man trying to make sense of a failed relationship. He also looks like someone who needed the story to keep passing through him so he could keep defining what it meant. And that is the larger point about public breakups. They do not only reveal pain, they reveal who can turn pain into a usable story. One person says she ran because she was guilty. The other says she left because staying meant one more round of the same pressure with different wording. When you test both against the visible pattern, the second claim holds together better, because it explains both Lisa's silence and Daniel's need to keep emotional authorship. The first claim only explains Lisa. The second explains both of them. So by this stage, the sharpest read is not that Daniel was only devastated by losing Lisa. That would be cleaner and more flattering, and life rarely bothers with either. The sharper read is that losing Lisa was one wound, but losing control over how the breakup would be remembered may have been the deeper one. Because heartbreak hurts, but for the person who still thinks the final version belongs to them, being cut out of authorship hurts in a completely different way. After all the pressure, the strangest emotional turn is that the ending does not land like pure devastation. It lands, at least in part, like relief. And that is harder for some viewers to accept, because people are trained to think the biggest emotion in a breakup has to be collapse, screaming, begging, some grand final wreckage that proves the love was real. When in fact, one of the clearest signs a person is finished is not louder pain, but quieter breathing. Not revenge, not a theatrical confession, not one last public trial, but the visible loosening that comes when someone no longer feels responsible for managing the whole emotional climate by themselves. That is why the airport energy matters so much in the public material. Lisa is emotional. Yes, the goodbye hurts. The whole thing is heavy. But under the sadness, there is another layer. And it is not the same as surrender. It feels like release. The trip that once carried engagement energy now carries separation energy, and the contrast is right there in her own words when she says the last time they were there, she got engaged to him. This time, the mood is entirely different. The relationship is no longer moving forward under a fantasy. It is dragging itself to a point where distance finally becomes possible. And that emotional difference matters because a lot of viewers still confuse visible distress with total defeat. They see tears and assume the crying person has lost. They see the more composed person and assume that person still holds the power. That reading is often wrong. The loud person often owns the scene, but owning the scene is not the same as owning the ending. Sometimes the person who leaves without feeding one more round of emotional theater is the only one who has truly stepped out of the system. That is what gives a quiet exit its force. It does not need to look glamorous. It does not need to look fearless. It only needs to break the old pattern. Lisa's emotional state in that goodbye fits that harder, sadder kind of release. She is not celebrating. She is not suddenly unhurt. She is grieving what she hoped this relationship would be. Grieving what she invested in it, grieving the version of herself that kept trying to make the whole thing work. But grief and relief can sit in the same body at the same time. People hate that because it ruins the cleaner TV narrative where one person is crushed and the other is triumphant. Life is ruder than that. A person can cry because something matters and still feel lighter because the pressure finally has an exit. And Daniel's side only sharpens that contrast. In the same farewell stretch, when he talks about being afraid she might never come back, his own words push the story away from pure heartbreak and toward future loss, promises, and the fear that she might change her mind about bringing him to her country. That detail is hard to ignore because it shifts the emotional center again. It suggests that even at the goodbye, the relationship is not only being felt as lost love, it is also being felt as slipping leverage, slipping plans, slipping access to the life he believed was still within reach. That does not mean he felt nothing. It means his fear had more than one object, and one of those objects was clearly control over the future. That is why this section works better as relief than chaos. Chaos would be easier. Chaos gives everyone their assigned roles. Chaos lets Daniel keep participating at full volume. Relief takes something from him. Relief means Lisa is no longer trying to win the emotional argument on his term. It means she is no longer offering the same reaction loop that kept the whole connection alive even while it was failing. And once that loop breaks, the power map changes in a way many viewers miss because it does not look flashy enough for television. The person who stops feeding the scene often becomes the only person not trapped inside it. There is also a challenge for the audience here. A lot of people still want the final image of strength to be loud, direct, crushing, cinematic, the sort of exit where somebody delivers the perfect final line and leaves the other person speechless. Nice fantasy. Rarely how real damage ends. More often, strength looks smaller and stranger. It looks like emotional exhaustion finally turning into distance. It looks like not correcting every false read. It looks like no longer needing to be fully understood by the person who kept turning understanding into a contest. It looks like a goodbye that hurts and still feels cleaner than staying. So yes, the silence creates room for Lisa to breathe. It creates space where she is no longer standing in the same emotional courtroom. It gives the ending a form that belongs more to distance than punishment. But the question does not vanish with the plane, and that is what keeps this section from going soft. Did silence finally give her peace, or was Daniel still able, even after she stepped away, to pull the story back into his orbit by shaping how that goodbye would be seen and remembered? By now, the hardest truth in this whole story is also the least flashy one, which is probably why so many people miss it on the first watch, because this was never only about who won each argument, who lied first, who explained badly, who cried at the wrong moment, or who looked more sympathetic in. Any single scene, it was about the kind of dynamic that had formed by the end, and once you stop grading the relationship moment by moment and start looking at the pattern as a whole, the shape gets a lot uglier and a lot clearer. So take the simplest version of Daniel's defense and give it full credit before testing it. Because if you are going to be fair, you do not weaken the other side to make your point look stronger. Daniel was hurt. He had reason to feel misled. He had reason to ask hard questions. He had reason to doubt what he was being told, especially once the story around him stopped feeling stable. No serious person should pretend otherwise. If somebody thinks key facts were hidden, confusion does not make them controlling by default. Sometimes pressure comes from panic. Sometimes repeated questions come from damage. Sometimes people circle the same issue because they cannot emotionally process what they have heard the first time. Fine. Give all of that room. Now test it. If the goal was healing, why did every road lead back to pressure? Healing does not look neat, but it does move. Even when it is slow, even when trust is wrecked, healing creates some sense that the conversation is taking you toward a decision, toward softer ground, toward a different pattern than the one that caused the injury. But with Daniel and Lisa, the visible rhythm kept snapping back to the same structure. Question, explanation, tension. Another question, another explanation, more tension. That is not movement. That is a loop. If the goal was clarity, why did the conflict seem to need fresh fuel every time? Clarity is supposed to reduce the emotional fog even when the answer hurt. Yet what kept standing out in this relationship was how often new information seemed to extend the instability instead of closing it. That is the part Daniel's strongest defense struggles to explain. A person seeking clarity reaches a point where the answer, even a bad one, forces a next step. A person who still benefits from the uncertainty keeps the uncertainty alive. That does not require some cartoon-level evil plan. It only requires a dynamic where the unresolved state is still giving one side leverage, access, or moral advantage. And if the goal was love, then why did the ending feel more like an escape than a breakup? That question cuts the deepest because it reaches past every single disputed detail and lands on the emotional reality the audience could feel by the end. Breakups hurt. That alone proves nothing. But not every breakup carries the same emotional texture. Some feel like grief between two people who ran out of road. This one, by the end, felt increasingly like one person was trying to get out of a system that had turned every response into fresh exposure. That does not make Lisa pure. It does make the dynamic hard to romanticize. Now bring back the pattern from the start and tighten it, because the story has been telling on itself the whole time. Daniel says he wants truth. Receipt. The tension stays active even after more truth enters the room. Reframe. Maybe truth was not the endpoint. Daniel says he wants answers. Receipt. Lisa keeps answering, but the emotional trial never seems to close. Reframe. Maybe answers were not enough because the process itself had become the point. Daniel appears calm. Receipt. The calm coincides with moments where he still seems to believe he has the upper hand. Reframe. Maybe the calm was not centered maturity. Maybe it was confidence inside a pattern he thought he still controlled. And again, fairness matters here. Daniel does not need to be a mastermind for this reading to hold. He does not need to sit there thinking, I will now maintain narrative dominance like some low-budget movie villain in a blazer. Human beings are usually less self-aware and more repetitive than that. A person can genuinely feel hurt and still slide into using hurt as structure. A person can think they are fighting for honesty while also becoming attached to the power imbalance the search for honesty create. That is what makes this more unsettling, not less. The pattern does not need cartoon intent to become real, which brings the whole thing back to the opening reversal with more force than ever. Because the biggest shock in this story was never that Lisa left. Reality TV is full of couples who split, cry, threaten, reconcile, implode again, and leave viewers acting surprised every single season as if memory loss is part of the viewing package. No, the bigger shock was what Lisa's quiet exit revealed after the fact. Once she stopped feeding the cycle, the full shape of the cycle became visible. Leaving quietly did not hide the pattern. It exposed it. By the end, Lisa leaving without one last emotional performance changes the whole story. Because once you remove the final blow-up people keep waiting for, once you remove the perfect confrontation, the dramatic confession, the last screaming match where everybody gets to empty their pockets and declare themselves right for the audience, you are left with something colder and, in a strange way, more revealing, which is that silence did what all the arguing never managed to do. It exposed the real structure underneath everything. That is the part worth holding on to. Not whether every single argument had a clean winner. Not whether Lisa handled every moment well. Not whether Daniel was hurt, because he clearly was. The sharper truth is that the ending told you what the relationship had become. If one more conversation was supposed to save it, why did the silence feel more final than all the talking? If one more answer was supposed to fix it, why did the absence of an answer hit harder than every explanation that came before? And if this was still only about love, why did the final shift feel less like a breakup between two people and more like one person stepping out of a machine that had been running on her reactions for too long? That is why the quiet exit matters so much. It did not give Daniel what he seemed to need most. No final round. No last emotional collapse to measure himself against. No closing scene where he could test one more explanation, challenge one more feeling, reshape one more version of the past, and leave with the comfort of believing the frame still belonged to him. Whether he understood that consciously or not almost does not matter by this point. What matters is the effect. He did not get one more shot at controlling how the ending unfolded in real time, and once that chance disappeared, all the earlier patterns started reading differently. The calm no longer looked so neutral. The repeated pushes no longer looked so simple. Lisa's emotional exhaustion no longer looked like weakness. Even the pauses changed meaning. What once looked like indecision started looking like withdrawal. What once looked like confusion started looking like the slow building of distance. That is the final payoff. Lisa leaving quietly did not interrupt the story. It translated it. It turned the whole relationship backward and made earlier moments easier to read with the benefit of the ending. And this is why silence hit harder than any fight. A fight would have fed the system one last time. A fight would have kept everybody in character. Daniel would still get to question, Lisa would still get pulled into response, and the whole thing would still end on familiar terms. Loud, painful, and somehow still unfinished. Silence denied all of that. Silence refused the final performance. Silence did not beat the system by overpowering it. Silence beat the system by starving it. And for a dynamic built on reaction, that is the one ending that lands like a real loss. None of this makes Lisa flawless. None of it turns Daniel into some exaggerated cartoon villain, which is good because those versions are easier to consume and much less useful to think about. The sharper read is simpler than that. Two people got stuck inside a pattern where truth was no longer acting like truth, because truth is supposed to force clarity, and this version of truth kept producing more pressure instead. One person kept trying to get enough of the story to settle the relationship. The other person by the end looked like he still needed the relationship unsettled in order to keep his position inside it. That is not a moral lesson. That is the pattern the ending leaves behind. And once you see that, the final image is not Lisa running. It is Lisa refusing to keep participating. That is why the goodbye feels sad and clean at the same time. Not clean because nothing messy happened. Clean because for once the ending did not need another argument to prove itself. The absence of that argument said enough. Daniel may have wanted one more answer, one more chance to tighten the frame, one more opening to stand inside the stronger role. He did not get it. And the brutal beauty of that is how ordinary it looks from the outside. No fireworks, no speech, no giant public collapse, just the quiet realization that the whole system lost its final round because one person stopped showing up for it. That is the thought this story leaves behind. The biggest blow was not the breakup itself, it was the way the breakup happened. Because a loud ending would have let Daniel feel included in it. A quiet ending forced him to live with something much harsher. An outcome he could react to, talk about, and try to reinterpret, but not direct. And once you notice how much of the story turns on who gets to own the final version, another case opens almost by itself. Because this is not the only couple where control hides behind concern, patience, or the performance of being the reasonable one, and the next story gets even darker when the person claiming calm starts looking less like the safe one, and more like the one who always needed the emotional upper hand.